She was shot, losing blood, and anchoring his twins to her chest so fiercely it looked like they were part of her own body. The man who had turned South Korea upside down looking for those infants for 72 hours found her first. He was a man built on ivory tower control, and a heart of absolute zero, and the last thing he expected was to feel anything except gratitude. But gratitude doesn't make your hands shake. What he felt did. The black sedans cut through the Busan fog like silent sharks, arriving at Kang Hyun's private estate before the sun could touch the horizon. He carried Maya Roberts himself, her blood seeping into the expensive wool of his charcoal suit, a stain that would have once been an unforgivable breach of his clinical perfection. He bypassed the perimeter guards, ignoring the stunned silence of his elite security team. To bring an unvetted stranger into this sanctuary was more than a security risk, it was a surrender. In the sterile glow of his private surgical suite, the air smelled of ozone and cedar. Hyun watched from the shadows, his jaw tight as the lead surgeon struggled to peel Maya's arms away from the empty space where the twins had been. "It's not just the bullet," the doctor whispered, his voice trembling under Hyun's obsidian gaze. "Her muscles have locked into a state of permanent tetany. She held your children so hard, for so long, that her body has forgotten how to let go." Hyun looked at the deep, white indentations on Maya's forearms. He had built an empire on calculated debts, but as he watched her hands remain curled in a phantom embrace, he realized he was facing a debt he could never repay with money. The following 72 hours were a hollow nightmare of clinical precision failing against primal need. Inside the soundproofed walls of the Gangnam penthouse, Seo and Mia drifted into a terrifying, rhythmic grief. They refused the gold-plated bottles and the softest silks, their tiny lungs raw from screaming for the only heartbeat that had stayed steady in the dark. Every time a nurse approached, the twins recoiled, their eyes searching the sterile air for a geography they already knew. Kang Hyun stood in the glass-walled corridor, his obsidian gaze fixed on the monitors. He was a man who moved mountains with a phone call, yet he was powerless against the shivering of his own bloodline. "Move her," he commanded, the words sounding like a surrender. By his order, Maya was transferred from the medical wing to the master suite, her bed positioned where the twins could see her through the nursery's open door. The shift was immediate. The moment Maya's shadow fell across the cribs, the twins fell into a deep, exhausted silence. As Hyun watched her sleep under the heavy guard of his elite enforcers, the line between guest and captive dissolved. She was the only thing keeping his world from fracturing, and that made her the most dangerous person in the building. At 2 a.m., the penthouse was a cathedral of glass and silent grievances. Kang Hyun found her in the kitchen, a wraith in an oversized silk robe, moving with a guarded grace that the bullet wound couldn't steal. The scent of chamomile and honey cut through the sterile cedar air. She didn't flinch when he entered, she simply pushed a second ceramic mug across the marble island. "Insomnia is a heavy price for a throne," Maya murmured, her amber eyes reflecting the city lights of Gangnam below. Hyun sat, his platinum watch catching the dim overhead glow. "My father taught me that sleep is a vulnerability. He preferred a son who was a weapon." Maya leaned against the counter, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "And mine taught me that people are just currency. To Sterling, even a daughter is an investment meant to yield a return." In the quiet, the distance between the predator and the survivor narrowed. They were two architects of different empires, both raised in the freezing altitude of the elite, where affection was a transaction and trust was a myth. For the first time, Hyun didn't see a threat or a savior, he saw a mirror. Long after Hyun retreated to the security corridor, Maya sat beside the twins' cribs in the dark and spoke in a voice barely above breathing. She told Seo and Mia about a little girl who had grown up in a house where every room was a boardroom, and every embrace came with a ledger. "Sterling used to say," she whispered, her thumb tracing Mia's small fist, "A Roberts doesn't bleed for strangers, *." She had spent 26 years trying to believe him. In the corridor, Hyun had pulled up the nursery feed to run a routine security check. He watched her on the monitor instead, her bronze shoulders curved around the cribs like a parenthesis, her lips moving in the dark, and something in his chest shifted on its axis. He had spent 4 days cataloging her as a variable. What he saw on that screen was not a variable. It was a woman teaching his children, without words, what safety felt like. He closed the feed before she could become something he couldn't afford to lose. The blue light of the tactical monitors turned Kang Hyun's face into a mask of static and ice. Lieutenant Kang stood at a rigid distance, his hand hovering over a decrypted file that felt like a detonator. A high-level burst transmission from Sterling Roberts' private server had been intercepted over the Incheon grid, and a single name pulsed in the encrypted lines, Maya. A direct directive, boss, the lieutenant whispered, his voice as sharp as a razor. The target is confirmed inside the perimeter. Priority 1. Hyun stared at the screen, his obsidian eyes narrowing until they were nothing but dark slits of suspicion. The late-night tea and the shared admissions of loneliness suddenly felt like carefully laid traps. In his world, a woman who looked like a savior was usually a soldier in disguise. He thought of the twins sleeping peacefully in the next room, their safety tethered to a woman whose father was currently dismantling his shipping routes. Doubt, cold and corrosive, began to leak back into the platinum cage of his heart. He didn't see a girl hiding from a monster anymore. He saw a Trojan horse waiting for the sun to go down. Somewhere between Incheon and Busan, Sterling Roberts sat in the back of a blacked-out convoy with the patience of a man who had never once been surprised by human weakness. His extraction commander's voice crackled through the encrypted line, awaiting final confirmation. Sterling gave it without hesitation. "The woman is a liability I indulged too long," he said, his gold rings catching the highway lights like cold teeth. "The assets are leverage. The man is noise. Treat them accordingly." He ended the call, and looked out at Seoul's skyline bleeding orange into the dark horizon. There was a third party, one whose name had not appeared in any of Hyun's intelligence files, one whose interest in the twins predated even Sterling's own, and Sterling had promised them a delivery. Maya's interference had not cancelled that promise. It had merely complicated it. He allowed himself one moment that resembled regret, the way a stone resembles warmth when the sun has just left it, and then it was gone. The convoy accelerated into the dark. The red emergency lights bled into the hallway like an open vein, as the penthouse alarms shrieked. Kang Hyun didn't run for the perimeter, he ran for Maya. He intercepted her near the nursery, his hand closing around her throat with a chilling, practiced precision as he pressed the barrel of his silenced pistol against her temple. "How much did he pay you to bleed for them?" Hyun's voice was a jagged rasp of pure betrayal. "Was the bullet in Busan just part of the choreography, Maya?" Her amber eyes went wide, reflecting the obsidian darkness of his gaze, but she didn't beg. "Hyun, I'm not." The rest of her plea was swallowed by the sudden, deafening crack of high-caliber rounds. The floor-to-ceiling glass of the master suite disintegrated into a million diamond-sharp shards, as sniper fire from the adjacent skyscraper tore through the air. Outside, the black silhouettes of Sterling Roberts' extraction team rappelled from the roof. Hyun didn't flinch as a bullet grazed the marble pillar beside them. He only pressed his gun harder against her skin, his heart a cold engine of war, convinced that the woman in his arms was the beacon that had led the monsters to his door. The air was a storm of pulverized drywall and lead. Through the haze, a voice boomed from the tactical comms, Sterling Roberts, cold and transactional. "Maya, enough. Hand over the assets and walk out. I'll clear your debt. You don't have to die for a ghost." Kang Hyun's grip on his weapon faltered as he watched Maya's reaction. She didn't look at the exit. She didn't look at the money. With a jagged cry that tore through the gunfire, she threw herself across the cribs, her body a trembling barricade of bronze skin and sheer will. A stray round clipped her shoulder, painting the white nursery walls with a fresh spray of crimson, but she didn't flinch. She simply tucked Seo and Mia deeper into the shadows of her own frame, her amber eyes fixed on the door with a predatory defiance. In that heartbeat, the platinum cage of Hyun's suspicion shattered. A Trojan horse doesn't bleed twice for the same prize. He saw the truth written in her blood, she wasn't the beacon, she was the shield. Roaring a command to his men, Hyun stepped into the line of fire, no longer a warden, but a partner in her desperate stand. The penthouse had stopped bleeding but not grieving. Smoke clung to the ceiling like a second skin, and the floor was a graveyard of shattered glass and spent casings. Hyun's medics had sedated him against his will, and the twins slept in the temporary crib his lieutenant had dragged to the center of the least damaged room. Maya was the only one awake, not because anyone asked. Because her hands needed something to hold that wasn't a gun, or a child, or the 30 seconds in which a sedated man had reached for her without knowing he was doing it. She had let him. 30 seconds exactly. Then she had stood, and begun to gather the fragments of the life she was about to walk back into alone. Hyun's lieutenant watched her from the doorway and said nothing. There was nothing in his operational training that covered this. A wounded woman sweeping glass at 4 in the morning with the quiet efficiency of someone who had always cleaned up after other people's wars. He stepped aside when she finally walked past him, her bag on her uninjured shoulder, her jaw set like a door that had decided to close. The penthouse was a wreckage of broken glass and spent shell casings by the time the smoke cleared. Maya Roberts didn't wait for the medic's final stitch or for Kang Hyun to open his eyes from the sedative. She left the platinum cage behind, her shoulder bandaged and her jaw set. Under the relentless, charcoal rain of a neutral shipping yard in Ulsan, she stood across from her father. Sterling Roberts leaned against his black sedan, his gold rings glinting like cold teeth. "You've made a mess of a perfectly good investment, Maya," he rasped, the scar on his cheek twitching. "Come home. I'll forget you chose the enemy." Maya stepped into his personal space, the scent of gunpowder still clinging to her skin. "I'm not your investment, Sterling. And I'm not coming home." She pulled a digital drive from her pocket, the one she'd lifted from Hyun's terminal during the siege. "Every transaction, every ghost ship, every life you've traded is on this. If you ever breathe the same air as those twins again, I will burn your empire to the ground from a witness stand." She turned her back on his fury, choosing a lonely, honest exile over a throne of blood. The cafe in Ulsan was the kind of place that asked no questions, formica tables, fluorescent light, tea that arrived without ceremony. Maya sat for 2 hours with the hard drive on the table in front of her, and a cup she did not drink. She thought about the twins. She thought about 30 seconds. She thought about the fact that she had walked away from Sterling's voice without her hands shaking for the first time in 26 years, and she could not decide if that meant she had finally become free or finally become as cold as he had always needed her to be. She pressed her fingertip against the edge of the drive. A Roberts doesn't bleed for strangers, she had bled twice. She supposed that settled the question of what kind of Roberts she was. She did not decide anything in that cafe. She simply arrived, eventually, at the understanding that standing still was no longer available to her as an option. She put the drive in her bag, left the tea untouched, and walked out into the gray Ulsan morning, pointing herself, without quite admitting it, toward the sea. The fog at the Incheon ferry terminal was a thick, suffocating gray, swallowing the departure gates and the ghosts of Maya's past. She stood at the edge of the pier, her bag heavy and her shoulder throbbing, ready to disappear into the anonymity of the sea. But the sound of a familiar, rhythmic stride stopped the breath in her lungs. Kang Hyun emerged from the mist, his charcoal coat unbuttoned, his obsidian eyes stripped of their calculating armor. He didn't come with an extraction team, he came alone. "I spent 15 years building a fortress of silence because I thought control was the only thing that could keep me whole," he said, his voice raw against the crashing waves. "But a throne is just a gilded cage if you're the only one in it. I was wrong, Maya. Control is a lie." He stepped into her space, his hand reaching out not to grab but to offer. "I'd rather be vulnerable with you than safe in a world where my children forget the sound of your voice." Maya looked at his extended hand, and then back at the dark water. She chose the man. Together they walked away from the terminal, leaving the war of their fathers behind to build a sanctuary where Seo and Mia would finally learn that power is cheap, but love is the only empire worth defending. Thanks for watching this episode of Dominus Tales. We're building a library of cinematic stories just like this one. If you want to support the channel, hit the like button and subscribe to stay notified of our weekly releases. Don't forget to drop a comment with your theories on what happens next. Your engagement helps us keep the tales alive.